This episode, we're going to be asking the question, so what are the impacts of these reports? In episodes 2 and 3, we looked at the results of the 2019 report and found that only 3 out of the 7 targets are on track. But improvements are being seen, it's just that the targets are moving targets, and so the non-Indigenous population is seeing the same progress, meaning that the gap stays open. The first thing we're going to be looking at is how the reports on Indigenous health more broadly are discussed in the media and its impact. A study examining the media portrayal of Indigenous public health issues in Western Australia found that during 2012, a total of three-quarters of the articles found and analysed were negative, 15% were positive, and 11% were neutral. They focused on topics such as alcohol use, child abuse, petrol sniffing, violence, and suicide. The framing of people or groups in terms of deficiency is known as deficit discourse. As opposed to progress, it's often favoured by journalists because it is seen as being more newsworthy. It particularly denotes speech that narrowly places responsibility for the problems with the affected individuals or groups, overlooking the larger socioeconomic structures in place. It is involved with race-based stereotypes, and there's evidence that it's a barrier to improving health outcomes. To be clear, a discussion around problems, facts, and issues of socioeconomic disadvantage is not in itself deficit discourse. It's when the dialogue and policy is so bogged down in a reductionist narrative of dysfunction and failure that Indigenous people are seen as the problem. Deficit discourse impacts on the health and well-being of Indigenous people in many different ways. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who constantly hear these negative stories may internalise negative beliefs about their identity, which can contribute to low self-esteem and psychological distress. It can also influence the choices they make about their health. For example, a 2008 study in the United States gave African American adults different statements about colon cancer. All the statements were true and based on the same data. The only variation was how each statement was framed, some negative and some positive. They found that the participants that read the negative articles were more likely to have a negative response and less likely to want to be screened afterwards. The Closing the Gap reports were explored as a case study within a report completed by the Luija Institute and the National Centre for Indigenous Studies. They describe the strategy as being dominated by deficit metrics. They note that while these stats can be used to make demands on various governments, they can also form a restrictive deficit narrative that homogenises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Focusing on such a limited range of indicators and targets can occasionally eclipse the underlying reasons for the differences in the stats. This includes lack of access to appropriate health services, structural inequities, and racism in the provision of healthcare, as well as the different values and life choices made by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that at times falls outside mainstream norms. This can result in Indigenous people being seen as a difficult problem to be dealt with, or worse, being blamed solely for the inequities they face. And this itself is then a barrier to improving health outcomes. So, this has been a bit of a bummer of an episode, but stay tuned for the next one where we're going to look at some of the positive impacts of the Closing the Gap reports. This has been part 4 of Closing the Gap Explained. For sources, further information, and the rest of the videos in this series, head to my website. Cheers!